All right, now I think probably the most exciting part everyone's waiting for to see you in action. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen and we can dive into this penetration testing demo. Like I said, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in throughout. We'll try to, if they're relevant to what Keatron's doing, I'll try to get them to them right away. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end.
Absolutely. All right, so can you see Google, Jeff, on my screen?
Yeah, I can see it. And for everyone else on the call, you should be able to arrange the widgets to expand the media player if you need to see what Keatron's doing.
So one of the things that you have to remember about pen testing, and I think people forget about this part because they want to jump straight to the hacking, there's quite a bit of research, and we call this reconnaissance, that you do before you break into a target. And consequently, it's the same process that a malicious threat actor would go through if they were trying to break into your organization. They wouldn't just pick you out of a box and just start throwing things at you. They would do reconnaissance and research about you. And then based on what they find, they would start trying to break in. So I want to just show just a couple of minutes of that before we get into scanning and stuff like that. So in this particular case, what I did was pull just a very pretty well-known webcam or security camera, Google hack here, where if you do this query, it shows you unprotected webcams of the brand, of this particular brand called Axis. So what you can do is if you click on these, and we could just even take airport off, for example. If you click on these, what you're seeing is actually real live webcam feeds there that's showing up. So you can see what that web camera sees. And what's scary about that is Axis is one of the brands that a lot of organizations use as kind of like security cameras. They've replaced like the closed circuit TV with this brand. And you can see a lot of times, behind secure facilities, places where you definitely shouldn't be able to see. For those that are, there's one in here that I like to show, Buffalo Trace. Yeah, for those of you that are into any type of scotch or anything or liquor or anything like that, Buffalo Trace has one that you can watch the factory. And I think it was initially put up for managers and supervisors to, because if you imagine, I mean, this is like somewhere in, where a pretty isolated place, they probably have some concerns of people like taking bottles and things like that out, or maybe they do, who knows. But the problem is we can actually control this camera, right? So for example, if I wanted to, make it pan left, for example, I could come up here and actually hit the pan left and it will pan left. Now what's happening is somebody else is controlling it currently. So I'm kind of like fighting for control, but eventually I'll be able to take it, and kind of make it go to where I want it to go to, as I win the fight with this person that's controlling it now. So these are some of the things that we do in the beginning of a pen test. Another thing I want to show you is a Google hacking database. And that is even a little more devastating because a lot of the stuff that you think about you having to hack to get, you don't necessarily have to if it's available out there. So what I'm going to do is show you how we can find information. Let's just, for example, see if we can find some good passwords that are out here in the public. So looking at this Google hack here, and basically these are just thousands of queries that other hackers and pen testers have put out here on how to do a Google query for a specific thing that you may be interested in. So there's like thousands of pages of queries here specifically aimed at finding passwords that shouldn't be out there. And let's look for something interesting here. All right, let's look at this one, this Yahoo site admin, because a lot of websites are still built using these site builders and these automated things like that. Well, what we have here is it shows us like, look, if you want to go out to Google and find people who built their websites with Yahoo site admin and didn't realize that by doing that, you're automatically storing your credentials in a file that's publicly reachable, you can just do this Google query. So we click it, it goes out to Google, does that query for us. And now we can actually see real websites here that are unprotected. And what I mean by that is without logging in or anything like that, we can go to the link, click on this db.conf file, and what I'm showing you here, all right, this username, that's an actual real username. This password, that's an actual password right there. And notice we got that information without logging in. We didn't have to do any hacking. It's just out there. So a big part of pen testing and hacking is just knowing how to look for information. And this passive stuff that I'm showing you here out on Google is a very, very important part of that. All right. So now let's move on to what would happen. You know, once we found all we could find out in the public, now we have to start doing what we call active scanning and active reconnaissance to try to go directly at a target. So in this case, if I were to use, I grew up about 20 miles from Mississippi State, so they don't mind me using them as a kind of a slight example here. So if we do a who is, and this is just using a tool that you'll learn about in the courses that we teach and things like that, it goes out and gets public DNS information about any domain or any target organization that you put in. We can see that it gives us some registration information. It gives us some people. And these two people that are listed here, I might even use them as, they might become social engineering targets, or I might use them to social engineer other people, right? I might use their email and these things to pretend to be somebody else to phish actual targets in the organization. But what ends up happening is we use that information for whatever. We might use other tools that are more passive or on the outside, like DNS Recon, to collect information about the domain like this. And this is going to be some very useful information. Let's do this. So I'm going for a range here, through who is and through some of the others. I found that Mississippi State owns this IP address range, right? And you could do that just by doing dig or pinging their website, and you would get one of these IPs back. But it appears that they own this entire network range just based on the fact that, all of these devices end with msstate.edu. So we can clearly see that there. That would make me think they probably own it. But one important part, going back to, it's not just about hacking and knowing how to use pen test tools. You do have to master the foundations of the operating system, because what you'd want to do with this data is write it to a file. We'll just call this demo test, or test it, if that works. You would write this information to a file locally so that you have it and you can parse it without having to constantly go back out to the internet to get it. Now, in this file, we can see that we've got that data. And one important part of being a pen tester is being able to take a lot of information that you get back from tools, parse that information down, clean it up, and use it in a way or do something with it that's useful. So for example, this is kind of a mess. I want to clean it up and extract out just the fully qualified domain name here in the IP address. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, let's put it in Excel and put a pivot table in there. Nope, we're going to do it right from the command line. So if I grep for the string PTR, let me show you where I got that. Seems like that is part of the data part of the file. So if I want just the data, it seems I can grab any line that's got that in it and get rid of all this other garbage at the top and the bottom. So if I try that cleans it up right away. But remember, all we want is just these two fields. So I'll take that result, pipe it out even further, and then I'll send that output to awk. And these lines here, for those of you who don't know, these are just, we call those pipes. So you're taking the output from this command and sending it to this command. Now we're taking the output from this command and sending it to awk. And I'm going to tell awk to print for me. Let's see, I want to do field, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's do fields 3 and 4. That's field 1, that's field 2, that's field 3, and that's field 4. So This is all just Linux command line, right? So I'm going to tell awk to print for me field 3 and field 4. And what I end up with is like a nice little collection of just the fully qualified domain name and IP address. So now that I see on the screen that it looks right, I'll write committed to the file. So now we got that data there. So as a pen tester, now you can parse through that, look for things that's important. For example, this is a university. So some things that might be important to look for would be like student, teacher, faculty. And sure enough, we get some interesting hits there. Now, you can all look at this, and I think you would all agree that as a hacker, if you're malicious or a pen tester, these two devices right here would definitely go in your box of these are interesting targets that I'm going to come back and spend a lot more time looking at later because it clearly says faculty credentials there. All right. Now, what ends up happening
Keatron, we have a question. Someone's
Sure.
wondering what tool it is that you're using right now on the screen, just so they know what it is you're using if they wanted to follow along in the future.
I'm just using Linux command line.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, it's just Linux commands. So there's no specific tool. The tool that I used to get this data was actually DNS Recon, but now I'm parsing data with just Linux command line. And keep in mind here, I'm not going at a pace to try to have you do this with me here. I'm just getting the information out. So if you want to try to do it with me, you probably want to get the recording when that's available and go back and pause it, because there's definitely not enough time for me to go at a really a instructional teaching pace, more just an information pace here that I'm going at. All right, so now that we got this information, you would then, actually start to scan your targets. And what I'm going to do is pretend like this machine right here is one of the IPs that we got back in that traffic, right? 182 there. So now I would become more active and I would scan that machine. With nmap here. And nmap is going to basically tell me what services are exposed or what ports are open, all right, on that device. You would then, as a pen tester, methodically go through each one of these ports and try to enumerate specifically what this reachable service is. Now, in this case, I'm going to kind of fast forward here and we'll jump to this port. But, understand that in real life, you would need to check all these, because as a pen tester, that's what you'd be getting paid to do. As a malicious hacker, you're just not checking everything if you don't do that, right? So if we go to port 8081, I'm going to specifically tell nmap to scan just that port now. And we're going to add another flag. And these flags and what they do, these are all the things that you learn, if you take the course. This flag is a version probe scan. So what this is saying up here is we think that that's what's running there because that's what typically runs on that port. We can't ever trust that as a pen tester or a hacker, so we have to say we need to validate. So by adding the SV flag, we're validating what's there by probing that service and interacting with it. And what we get back is it's actually running this, which is completely different than what it guessed in the beginning. And this is an important lesson because you can't always trust what you see in your first scan. You have to dig deeper, interrogate the services and things like that, so that when we get to the point of attacking, we're actually sure that we're attacking the right thing. Otherwise, you might blow something up or shut something down. And for a pen tester, that's bad because you may be costing your customer money. For a black hat hacker, that may be bad because now you've kind of revealed the fact that you're there, which takes away your stealth features. So now that we know the service is here, let me show you how quickly we go from, hey, we found a service to being able to exploit it. I'm literally going to copy this right out of the nmap output, go out to the internet, just go back to Google. And in Google, I'm simply going to search for vulnerabilities related to that service that I copied and pasted. And we quickly see there is a vulnerability from November of last year that seems to be highly rated. It does allow remote code execution or remote command execution. In short, what that means is this vulnerability is so bad that if I'm able to exploit it, it will allow me to take control of and execute commands on whatever machine it is that we're running this against. So it looks promising, but we need to validate it. It's related to the Rigetto service. So I need to go back to my Kali instance here and just see if there's any exploits related to Rigetto built in. If not, I may have to go out to the internet and download that exploit and make it into something that I can use. But fortunately for me, there appears to be quite a few exploits related to it in Kali. There's even one in the famous tool Metasploit there. So I'm gonna opt to use Metasploit because we use that a lot in the courses. I'll start Metasploit up, and then once Metasploit is running, I'm going to look for that specific vulnerability and exploit that we just discovered there. Right? So I search for it. It says, yep, here it is. Now I go ahead and load that exploit. And you will see people using this exploit a lot to demonstrate exploitation because it's a very solid one and it's very predictable as far as how it works. So I want you to think of the exploit here as a missile that I'm shooting at a target. And as you know, with the missile, you have to have a payload in the missile because the missile has to do something. Once it hits the target, do you want it to explode that target? Do you want it to disable electronics in that target? Do you want it to spit out some chemical that causes people to gag? Like, what do you want that missile to do for you once it pierces that target? And in this case, in the form of Metasploit, the payload, the missile is here, it's the exploit, and the payload is what we put inside the missile. And what we're putting inside is something called a reverse interpreter session, which we're saying we want this missile to go hit the target, and then once it's there, execute this code that phones home back to us and sends us over that connection a command shell that will allow us to control that machine. That's what we're telling it to do. But in order for it to do that, we have to tell it how to get back to us or what our return address is. And in Metasploit, that's called lhost, which my IP address escapes me right now, is 186. So we have to tell it to come back to us because everything we put here is going into this payload. So we're saying we want this type of payload, and now we're giving it the specific things to put in that payload, right? Now we have to tell Metasploit who our target is. In other words, that's who we're going after. And then we have to tell it what port that service that we're trying to exploit is running on. Now, it's important to note, as a pen tester, what you're doing right here is you're just validating whether or not the vulnerability exists. Because you might run a scan and see a software and it might look like it's vulnerable, but maybe on the back end, they've done some patching or they've done something to it to make it not exploitable. But as a pen tester, that's your job, is to check to see if it's indeed exploitable. As a hacker, you have to check because you can't assume that, you know, everything's patched. If you look at what's happened in the industry, if you take the 5 most critical data breaches and ransomware attacks from 2021 so far, the thing they all have in common is they were all relatively low-hanging fruit types of exploits. There was no groundbreaking way that these people got into these organizations. They were all things that were patchable. They were all things that should have been fixed before the attackers got to it. So as a pen tester, you can't assume that an organization, no matter who the organization is protected from all these things, because you're likely to, to find that you're disappointing yourself. So we go ahead and launch our missile, or we launch the exploit. And right away, we see we got success there because it says a session is open, which means we are now actually connected to that machine. To prove that, we can drop into a command shell. We can run ipconfig, and we can see that we are indeed sitting on the command line of that victim machine right there. If you go over to the actual victim, you can see that this is it. And now we essentially have the ability to give ourselves some control over that machine. If we look at who we're currently running as, very basic permissions here, it's just a local user. One of the first things that you normally do is try to elevate your privileges. So I will do that by finding or attempting to find a process that's running with elevated privileges. And in the world of Windows, as a lot of you know, the highest possible privilege you can have in Windows is not admin, not domain admin, not any type of system admin. The highest privilege you can have in Windows is system. So we want to get to that privilege level, right? And there's always a lot of processes in Windows that runs a system. So if you can migrate to or inherit or take over the memory space of any of those programs, you will then inherit their permission. And a good target is always system, which always runs as PID 4. And in this case, services, which runs as PID 572. So I'll try the easy way first. I'll try migrating into 572. And that didn't work because we have to now do something called privilege escalation to put ourselves in a position to be able to migrate into that process. But we can also try the easy route here. And this is its own little privilege escalation routine where it's automating what I just described, where it's doing privilege escalation. So we do that, it says it got system. So now if I drop back into my command shell and I say, who am I? We've now elevated ourselves successfully to the highest possible privilege you can ever have in Windows. As a matter of fact, no domain admin, domain administrator, system administrator can ever have this privilege level by logging in because you can't log in as system. You can only inherit that privilege by injecting into the memory space of something that's running as that privilege, because essentially it's reserved for the Windows kernel. And we've tricked it into giving us that privilege level. So we could do things like create a Jeff Rocks account here, because we're going to frame Jeff for all the hacks. That way, if the police come, we can point him out. And not only that, this is a domain controller, so we can actually, and if it weren't, we can just add him to the local administrators group. But we could actually try to add Jeff to the domain admins group, which means he has, as much power as the domain admins at this point. So let's do Jeff Rocks and say add. And sure enough, because we're system, Windows is not going to complain about that. Now, the last part of this, because we can move horizontally now and things like that, which is all part of the pen testing process. But due to trying to make sure we fit within the right time frame, what I'm going to do next is, move to the next phase, which would be covering your tracks or trying to make it not easy to identify that you were there and specifically what you did. And I wanted to show you give you like a little dose of that. And keep in mind, what we're doing here is we're showing you in 20 minutes, what we do over a 5-day period. So while it may seem like I'm going fast and these things are really, really deep and over your head for some of you, trust me, give me 5 days with you and it'll seem like it won't be that tough for you. You'll be able to figure it out. So what's happening now is I'm going to the victim and I want to show you in the event viewer where there's events that people can investigate. When we do forensics and incident response, the Windows event logs are key places that we look for evidence of things happening. And you can see that these logs have stuff in there. For example, the security log is full, the system log is relatively full, and the application log has a bunch of stuff in there as well. But watch this. So notice they're full now. I'm going to go over it as the attacker. I'm going to run the command clear EV in Meterpreter. And look at what it tells us it just did. It says it wiped those logs. All right. Even though I have a policy configured on that machine that says you can't erase logs without copying them off somewhere else first, it's still gone ahead and do it because it's running as system. So if we go over now and refresh these logs, look at the security one. It's relatively empty now. System is empty except for the fact that the logs were cleared. Application is empty. So when you go look at these logs, all you're going to see is we must have been hacked because the logs are cleared. And to be fair here, what I'm trying to show you is when it comes to covering tracks, there's generally two avenues you go down. One is anti-incident response, which means you just want to get rid of any evidence that you were there, but leave everything else intact so they don't even know you're there. But what we're looking at here is anti-forensics. So I'm assuming that the victim is going to know that I was there because maybe I'm going to sell their data on the internet or something. So when they come looking, all they're going to see is the logs were clear. And this might seem like a smoking gun because you might say, well, the fact that there's an event that says the logs were cleared tells me something. But what does it tell you? It actually tells you nothing, right? Because what's upper management going to want to know? How did they get in? What did they do when they got in? What did they take? What's the root cause? And we just taken away the ability for you to know any of that by clearing all the logs that would have shown how we got to this point. So it's all about what the objective is from the attacker standpoint. They're not always trying to keep you from knowing they were there, especially if they're going to eventually do something that's going to make it clear that they were there. And the covering your tracks phase is generally the last phase. Now, if this were a pen test, in the beginning, we would have a whole phase of pre-engagement activities like signing contracts, setting up a statement of work, creating a get out of jail free card. There's a whole bunch of legal stuff that goes in the front. So before you lift a finger to do any scan, you make sure all that legal stuff is set up. Make sure you've got a signed contract. A verbal contract doesn't count. You need to have a signed contract. And then towards the end, there's other stuff that we do after covering your tracks that's post engagement stuff, like, you know, writing a report, making sure that the report is what they want and all these things. And that is what a pen test would look like. And we just tested one system and only one service on that system. And you have to think about it. Every system has a potential 65,535 ports that you would need to scan and check for services, and then check those services for vulnerabilities for each system. Some of my clients have over 200,000 systems. So as you can imagine, the pen test can get very big and become very expensive. And I have a few clients that have, you know, less than 1,000 systems. Those pen tests don't cost as much. But the reason we use automated tools, everything I showed you here was manual, but we do purchase and use automated tools because of the scale. But make no mistake about it, if you don't understand how to do this stuff manually, like I just showed you, those big automated tools are going to be relatively useless to you. You're not going to be able to do anything with them that anyone couldn't pull it down, run, push run, and spit out a report for it. But if you really want to excel at pen testing and other areas, you need to dig in, learn how to do these manual exercises like this, because it sharpens your technical aptitude muscle to prepare you to do this and do a whole bunch of other things. I tell people all the time, I started as a pen tester, but I've grown a incident response practice, a threat hunting practice, all from this basic skill set. Everything that I just showed you here translates nicely to incident response, to forensics, to cyber threat hunting, and to cybersecurity engineering. So pen testing is a great place to start. And a lot of us that you see in the media and in the industry doing all these other big things, a lot of us started right here with pen testing. And we've got a perfect way to kind of get you up to speed on that. So I think I'll end the demo there, Jeff.